I'm always eager to cast a discerning eye over driver-team combinations. Your Michael Andretti's at McLaren or your Luca Badoer's at Ferrari, for instance. It can be really interesting to take the time to dive beneath the initial surface appearance of such seemingly disastrous and disappointing partnerships, and see if we can't figure out just why that became the case. If we bumped into one another in the streets and you simultaneously swiped my phone off me and took a peek into a note entitled The Mobile Chicane's Garage, you'd find it filled to the rafters with ideas, thoughts, and 3 a.m. ramblings for future videos, which honestly seemed like a stroke of genius at the time, but in the light of day, just reads Jensen Button ham sandwich ? In that note, you'd find other instances of insert driver here and insert team here that I'd be intrigued to tackle one of these days. Eddie Irvine and Jaguar, Alex Zanardi and Williams, Daniel Ricciardo and McLaren, Nigel Mansell and McLaren, Juan Pablo Montoya and McLaren. Hang on, there's a theme emerging here, isn't there? But few tales from F1 history stink of such missed opportunities and disappointment than the tenure of Kimi Raikkonen at McLaren in the mid-2000s. To an outsider looking in, that may seem an odd statement to make. After all, Raikkonen entered McLaren as a promising young talent, one who had silenced critics who had openly questioned whether he should even be allowed onto the F1 grid, and he departed there with armfuls laden with wins, poles and podiums, and a reputation, if not expectation, that here was a man worthy of multiple world titles, widely regarded as the one to end the dark days of Schumacher domination and begin a whole new era of a stranglehold at the top of the table. Yet arguably Raikkonen should have departed McLaren with so much more than that. For the Raikkonen-McLaren era was indisputably one of the most heartbreaking and frustrating eras for Formula One fans. Those fans take a look at the moans and the groans of the Charles Leclerc and Ferrari faithful and would frankly bite an arm, leg, and just about any other appendage off to have as minimal instances of misfortune as the Monegasque man has suffered comparatively. Between 2002 and 2006, Raikkonen entered 87 Grand Prix for McLaren, and on 39 occasions, 45% of the time, Raikkonen would suffer some form of mechanical breakdown or McLaren-based blunder. Just shy of every other race, Raikkonen was waving goodbye to points hauls, podiums, victories, and subsequent world championships. But why was that? And what, with a pinch of salt and a dash of reality bending, could the Raikkonen, McLaren, and Mercedes combo have achieved? Today we're going to take a deep dive into the mechanical and misfortunate maladies of Kimi Raikkonen's time at McLaren, and try to answer that. Raikkonen had leapt into F1 with Sauber in 2001 to the surprise of many. The Finn's racing experience at that point made Max Verstappen's later promotion to F1 seem like a grizzled veteran in comparison. Raikkonen had vaulted from British Formula Renault into the big leagues. Tier-wise, it was the equivalent of a football squad being promoted from League 2 straight into the Premier League. And when he would start the 2001 Australian Grand Prix, it would be only his 24th car racing start. And that perhaps justified just how long the FIA ummed and ahed over awarding Kimi his super licence, as well as their choice to closely monitor him across his first 4 races. That would be completely unnecessary. A point on debut was followed by another 8 points that year, and the paddock was sufficiently impressed by the Finn's raw speed. Already, people were mooting that here was the guy who could become Michael Schumacher's successor at Ferrari. 2 people who concurred with the belief in Raikkonen were McLaren's Ron Dennis and Mika Hakkinen. Hakkinen, 2-time world champion, was going on sabbatical for 2002, and Dennis needed someone to fill his seat. Many saw Mercedes junior Nick Heidfeld as the logical fit, but Hakkinen was found to regularly repeat his favourite poem to Dennis throughout the year, which heavily influenced Ron's final choice. If you want to win, get the Finn. And that's exactly what they did. It all started so well with 3rd place on his McLaren debut and could have been even higher after he outbraked himself when leaving the pits. Suffice to say thereafter, things did not continue to go well. 5 mechanical retirements on the bounce, an engine failure, cracked wheel rim, a broken exhaust, a rear wing failure, and then, presumably because McLaren had run out of things to break on the car, another engine failure. all from point-scoring positions too, denying Kimi another third place, as well as a couple of fourths and fifths. McLaren must have been quite glad for the Monaco Grand Prix, not because things went any better for Raikkonen, who retired for the 6th straight race, but because at least it couldn't be blamed on them this time, after Rubens Barrichello had smashed into Kimi at the chicane, taking the Finn out of 6th. Thereafter, Kimi enjoyed a rare spectacle of 2 consecutive races without any trouble, and a 4th in Canada was followed by 3rd in Europe. It should have been back-to-back podiums in Britain, but in damp conditions McLaren took a gamble on a switch to slick tyres. The rain said, "Nah, you're alright," and started getting heavier, resulting in another stop for the McLarens. From there they trundled around at the back before Kimi's engine decided to fail once more. A better strategy call and a touch of reliability would have surely provided Raikkonen a podium, who ran 3rd before that first stop, and was quoted at the time as eating Montoya and Schumi alive. At this point though, we begin to reach moments that we can't blame McLaren for, and in fact the blame for errors and mishaps lies squarely at the feet of one Kimi Raikkonen. For all the lamenting we do over the woeful reliability of the McLarens he was given, it can be easy to overlook the opportunities that Kimi personally let slip. Incident 1 was the French Grand Prix, where, with 5 laps to go, Raikkonen looked primed to take his first win, only to slide off track at the Adelaide hairpin, allowing Schumacher past and demoting him to 2nd place. Admittedly though, we can put a big old asterisk over such an error, as the slide off track was due to oil on the circuit, spilt from the blown engine of Alan McNish's Toyota. Even the most die-hard Kimi fans would struggle to find any form of asterisk over his performance in Germany, where he entered the pits running 5th and made the baffling choice not to change his tyres. That led to an entirely unsurprising blowout on the left rear, leaving the McLaren to limp back to the pits with both bodywork and engine damage for the remainder of the race, which wasn't that much more when he spun off later on. 4th in Hungary was followed by everyone's favourite trilogy of engine troubles: Shaun of the Engine Woes, Hot Blown Engine Fuzz, and the World's Engine Let's Go. The season was bookmarked with another 3rd place in Japan to round out the year. With 4 podiums and a fastest lap to his name, Raikkonen ranked 6th overall. Catching the all-dominant Ferraris, even factoring in better reliability and or some Dick Dastardly shenanigans, was never an achievable scenario. But with a reliable car at his feet and without the small handful of personal errors or bad luck, Raikkonen's points tally in 2002 leaps from an actual 24 to a theoretical 60, lifts him from 6th place to 3rd overall, and an even higher rise in stock in the F1 paddock. But that was just the tip of the hypothetical iceberg. 2003 is the first of the 2 most often lamented years of Kimi's time at McLaren, a year in which the record books proudly proclaim Michael Schumacher as a record-breaking 6-time world champion, a year in which many at home would argue a case for Tipexing that name out and scribbling in Kimi Raikkonen over the top. It seemed like the demons of France 2002 had been eradicated at the opening round. An error in qualifying prompted a pit lane start, but he'd soon carved his way into the lead by lap 17 and was looking good to finally take that first win. That was until his first stop, where he was found to have been speeding in the pit lane and was handed a slam-dunk drive-through penalty that dropped into an eventual 3rd. Not that Kimi had much to say in the matter. The pit lane incident had been caused by a software glitch in the car's electronics, leaving him a blameless party once more. Thankfully, Malaysia proved 3rd time's a charm, and it cantered to victory that day. Another win followed up in the chaos of Brazil. The race was stopped on lap 55, and the rules stated that the winner would be decided by the running order 2 laps before the stoppage. So that was all well and good, until a week later, when evidence emerged that Jordan's Giancarlo Fisichella, who had overtaken Raikkonen on lap 54, had started his 56th lap when the race was stopped. What followed was an awkward exchange of trophies before the next race in San Marino, and 2 points dropped. 2nd place that day was little reward to a win being overturned. What followed were 2 incidents which many will largely gesticulate at when explaining why and how Raikkonen failed to become 2003 world champion. The first was a minor one, when engine problems in Austria allowed Schumacher to catch and pass the McLaren for the win. 2 more points lost. But the second incident was by far the biggest. Pole in Europe became a comfortable lead during the race, and what appeared to be a nailed-on win. until for neither the first nor the last time, the Mercedes engine went the way of that forgotten carton of milk and expired. 10 whole points gone. People regularly motion at those engine problems as the only reason Raikkonen failed to be world champion that year. The same people, we can only assume, must avert their gaze when questioned about the errors from Kimi in that same period. A mistake in qualifying for Spain left him at the back of the grid, and therefore right behind the stalled Antonio Pizzonia, who Kimi collided into. No points there when third place was arguably doable. A poor start at Monaco allowed Montoya past, where he stayed till the end, a second clear of the McLaren. 2 points lost. And another qualifying error in Canada led to another pit lane start and an eventual 6th place finish. Admittedly, even without that qualifying error, 5th was maybe the best result available. 1 more point lost. After the heartbreak in Europe, his form seemed to slump, and 4th in France was followed by a 3rd in Britain. It perhaps should have been more at Silverstone when reports declared that the race was there for the taking, only for the Finn to lose his way. Such a slump may well have been due to factors out of his control once more. We'll touch on those later. It was unlikely much would have come from Germany, but we'll never know after he was caught up in a collision with Barrichello and was out on the spot. Along with 2 second places in the next 3 races, neatly sandwiched either side of his efforts in Italy, where he qualified, ran and finished in 4th. Schumacher won twice in the same period, leaving a 9-point gap between himself and Raikkonen going into the season finale in Japan. Schumacher required just a single point to claim his 6th world title, whilst all Kimi could do was slap a poster saying "Believe" and pray for misfortune for the Ferraris and a win for himself. But even the power of future Ted Lasso wouldn't be enough. Though Schumacher had an absolute shocker and just about scraped into 8th place, Barrichello took the win. So Raikkonen took 2nd place both that day and in the championship, just 2 points shy of Schumacher. The mathematics on this championship are a thankfully simple one. Provide Raikkonen with a preferably non-expiring Mercedes engine in the back of his car for the European Grand Prix, and you add 10 points to the tally of Kimi Raikkonen, subtract 1 from Michael Schumacher, and you come up with the grand total of Kimi Raikkonen, 2003 world champion, 101 points to 92. Or maybe you'd rather remove the electronic glitch in Australia. Raikkonen 95, Schumacher 93. It's very easy to gesture at mechanical errors like that and reach the conclusion that it was McLaren who lost the World Championship that year and not Raikkonen. But maybe what we don't consider enough is whether it was the inverse. If we amend the results to re-include the mechanical gremlins that struck, i.e. events out of his control, and adjust the races where his own errors drop points, i.e. events firmly within his control, Raikkonen could have still been world champion with 100 points to Schumacher's 93. All that separates that reality and this one is 2 qualifying mistakes and 2 bad starts. It didn't need to be perfect, no one can be, least of all a 23-year-old racer, but it just needed less easily avoidable errors, not a harsh ask for a third-year driver. And arguably controversially, did Raikkonen even deserve to win the title that year? That may sound harsh, but as one of my favourite old sites F1 Rejects put it at the time, all year Kimi has been undoubtedly consistent, but rarely was he able to take a race by the scruff of the neck and seize victory. With only 1 win all year to Michael's 6, in all honesty he would not have genuinely deserved the title had he pinched it. The final record of the year shows a 2-point deficit between himself and Schumacher, and it was arguably a generous reflection on Kimi's efforts. In 2003, points were now awarded to the top 8 finishers rather than the previously traditional top 6. And under that pre-2003 point system, the championship would have been wrapped up by Schumacher at the penultimate round. But there was one other factor at play that year that could have cost Kimi the world title. We briefly touched on it earlier, but occasionally Kimi would lose his way in races, and that wasn't his fault. No, there we can look left, right, down and around the Finn for the cause why: the car. As we've discussed, Kimi's efforts that year were consistent if unspectacular at times, but they were perhaps the limit for Raikkonen in what critics decreed an ageing car. For this was perhaps the biggest hurdle for Kimi to tackle all year, the McLaren MP4 17D, which was nothing more than a development version of the 2002 car. McLaren's actual 2003 car, the MP4 18, never made it to a race weekend. It made it to racetracks and it was tested multiple times. It was radical, it was fast, but it was, like any guest on an episode of Hot Ones, suffering from constant overheating problems. Mechanic Mark Priestley described it as perpetually on fire. After overheating problems on the gearbox internals caused floor delamination and a huge shunt for Raikkonen and test driver Alex Wurz, the car was neatly pushed to the side and never spoken of again. So Kimi was left to battle on in a year-old car that had struggled to match the Ferraris even the previous year. Such a car never stood a chance of keeping up in the development races, not assisted by McLaren continually glancing over their shoulders to see yet another failure on the radical MP4-18. In which case perhaps we can justify and excuse any errors from Raikkonen, who despite outward appearances was clearly bringing the ever-aging car to its absolute limits to achieve the best results possible. That can be reflected in the fact that he was the highest finishing McLaren in every race without any mechanical woes. Was it then McLaren's inability to get something right, in this instance an entire car, that cost Kimi the world title that year? Instead of entering 2004 as world champion, Kimi found himself looking to bounce back in style with another crack at the world title. But that year failed to make amends for the previous, as McLaren went above and beyond to make their most unreliable car yet. We've briefly touched on how Raikkonen's woes were not necessarily all McLaren's fault, but few could argue against that fact in 2004. Of the 18 races that year, Kimi's McLaren suffered reliability issues on 11 occasions, just shy of a 2/3 disaster rate. Of those that raced at every Grand Prix that year, only Minardi's Jean-Maria Bruni completed less laps than Kimi. Having come tantalisingly close to a world title in just his third season, the start to 2004 was nothing short of excruciating. After 7 races in 2003, Kimi was on top of the World Championship. At the same point a year later, he found himself in a lowly 16th place, behind even the backmarker Jordan of Heidfeld, with a solitary point to his name. Kimi would stall at the start of the Australian Grand Prix, but to his credit, recovered those places early on, only to retire after 9 laps with an engine failure. Not much more than 8th was arguably achievable that day, but a podium looked a solid bet in Malaysia, until a transmission failure hit with just 16 laps to go. Practice pace in Bahrain had hinted at another run at the podium, only for another engine failure to drop him to a back row start. 7 whole laps passed on race day before yet another engine went. So unreliable was the engine that McLaren were admitting they were having to limit their practice running through fear of further issues. Less practice time meant less time to unlock speed in the car, and more struggles for the drivers. Starting last once more in San Marino with, let's say it all together now, another engine change, he was finally able to break his point stack that year with a solitary point in 8th, but without that engine change, a 4th place looked within his sights. In Spain, for the first time all year, Kimi suffered no reliability issues, yet he probably wished for once that he had. The McLaren simply had no pace all weekend, and at lapped and lowly 11th was all he could extract from the car. Old adversary Michael Schumacher, meanwhile, had cantered to a 5th straight win. A sniff at 3rd in Monaco came to naught when his pneumatics failed a third of the way through the race. A seemingly certain P2 in Europe went out the window as the Mercedes engine lunched itself once more, and an extra stop to change steering wheels in Canada failed to drag him any closer to the podium, though Kimi hardly helped his woes by earning a drive-through penalty for touching the white line at pit exit. 5th that day could have been 4th at worst. Another trickle of points came from 6th in the USA, but again it would have and should have been a podium, but for 2 unscheduled stops to top up the pneumatic air system on the engine. There was some top 4 potential pace in practice for France, but an error in qualifying left him down in 9th, and he couldn't progress beyond 7th. Still, there was light at the end of the tunnel. France had seen the debut of the new car, the MP4-19B, and Kimi was already reporting a better rear end, better aerodynamics and a stronger engine, and that was perhaps reflected in his performance in the next round in Britain, where he took pole position, led the opening laps and finished 2nd. Those thinking this would be a turning point of the year for McLaren and Raikkonen were right to be cautious. He was running a safe 2nd in Germany and closing in on Schumacher, only for the rear wing to fail. It was back down into the mires of the midfield for Hungary, where he was running in and around the tail end of the point scorers, only for software problems to plague the engine and take him out. Just when it seemed like McLaren was settling in for a winless year, along came the Belgian Grand Prix, where, after 6 different drivers had taken the lead in and around several different safety car appearances, it was Kimi Raikkonen and McLaren who took top honours for what was, staggeringly considering his championship challenge the previous year, just the duo's second win together, and only the second non-Michael Schumacher win that year. The engine gremlins wasted no time in hijacking the car once more to deny Kimi 6th place in Italy, but seemingly decided that was enough punishment for the year, and the final 3 races passed without incident. 3rd in China was followed by 6th in Japan, and then 2nd place in Brazil. If we're really trying to dig into those results to find some extenuating circumstances, we can find a Raikkonen lamenting not being more aggressive in his defence from Montoya in Brazil. But perhaps after that year it would be a welcome return to take a safe 2nd place. He ranks 7th, a complete freefall from the silver medal position he'd occupied a year prior, and with less than half the points accumulated. From 10 podiums in 2003, he took just 4 in 2004. But unlike the previous year, there's little room for debate in who was to blame for such a dreadful drop-off. Bar the stalling in Australia, the drive-through in Canada, and the error in French qualifying, Raikkonen rarely put a foot wrong, whereas McLaren and Mercedes were putting just about every appendage in the incorrect spot. A better year sees Kimi more than double his points tally from 45 to a personal best of 96. From 7th he vaults to 3rd, best of the rest behind the dominant Ferrari duo, though just 13 points adrift of runner-up Rubens Barrichello. Not quite the redemption arc for the narrowly missed out on world title of 2003, but a far more respectful and acceptable year for a driver seemingly on a fast track to become F1's newest, most wasted talent. Still, there was always next year. So we head to 2005, and once more there's a distinct smell of Tipex in the air, as F1 fans hurriedly scratch over Fernando Alonso, 2005 world champion, and don't hesitate to scribble Kimi Raikkonen over the top of that. There weren't nearly as many car troubles like the previous year had seen, but the ones suffered in 2005 hurt so much more. The season started much like the last. Kimi stalls at the start of the Australian Grand Prix and finds his season starting from the pit lane. From there, he worked his way through to 8th place. But given the likes of Barrichello and Alonso, both of whom qualified behind him, would climb to the podium, a better start from Kimi could well have resulted in a 2nd place finish. It should have been a better points haul in Malaysia, as Raikkonen was running 4th after his first stop. But then a valve failure caused a right rear puncture and Kimi was left to limp back to the pits. He popped back out in 13th and couldn't make it any higher than 9th. 3rd in Bahrain marked the first podium of the year, and it should have been followed by the first win of the year in San Marino. Pole became an easy lead, became a drive shaft failure. To McLaren's credit, they weren't messing around with their issues this time, as the failure had come after just 8 laps. After the race, Dennis was begging anyone that had listened that Kimi should have absolutely walked that race. Mercifully, the wins did come back-to-back, a dominant pair in Spain and then Monaco, with Alonso seemingly unable to live with the Finns' pace on either occasion. By now it was clear Fernando and Renault were leading the charge to the championship, but Raikkonen and McLaren were top of the chasing pack in what was a faster, if more unreliable car. Case in point was Europe, easily one of F1's most iconic moments. Another win went by the wayside when the McLaren suspension spectacularly failed heading into turn 1 on the final lap, and finger pointing began in earnest. The suspension failure had resulted from an error from Raikkonen when lapping Jacques Villeneuve on lap 34, and he locked his brakes doing so. That created a flat-spotted tyre, and the resulting vibrations on the front right suspension caused it to fail. The regulations that year banned tyre changes in races unless the tyre was suitably damaged. McLaren were unconvinced it was and felt a change would have provided a hasty penalty. On one hand, such a failure was of Kimi's own doing, yet were the team in a position where they weren't chasing Alonso and Renault for points, maybe they could have taken the penalty hit and settled for guaranteed points. Instead, the early failures had forced McLaren's hand to gamble and stay out, to disastrous consequences. Alonso, who'd closed to within 1.5 seconds before the incident, happily took the win. Heading to North America, a rare bit of luck came Kimi's way in Canada when Alonso crashed out. Teammate Juan Pablo Montoya was disqualified, and the Finn was left to canter to win number 3 of the year. After that came Indianapolis. The 2005 US Grand Prix isn't so much a can of worms as an entire worm canning factory, but when the 14 Michelin-shod cars peeled off into the pits after the warm-up lap, after Michelin had admitted they couldn't guarantee either of their compounds making it safely through a race distance following some failures in practice for the Toyotas, we lost any form of race that day. America lost any form of respect for F1, and from Kimi's perspective, he lost some valuable points. He'd been due to start second, with Alonso down in 6th. From one lost race came 3 lost wins in a row. The first 2 were lost before any of the 5 red lights had even flickered on, thanks to a pair of grid penalties from engine failures in practice, demoting Raikkonen to the bottom half of the grid. Though he scrambled through to 2nd in France and 3rd in Britain, the pace he'd shown, helped with good strategy, left people in little doubt that had he been at the front of either race, he'd have won. It all should have been rectified in Germany, where Kimi held a commanding lead from pole, only for his hydraulics to fail after half race distance. For the 3rd time in 12 races, a certain win had gone right into the bin. In an alternate universe, the post-Germany scores would read Raikkonen 81, Alonso 81, and an absolute thigh rubber of a championship fight. Instead, those failures had provided an enormous 36-point swing in favour of the Spaniard, who led 87 to 51. There was a welcome flash of good luck in Hungary that allowed the gap to close up. Alonso trundled to a lapped 11th place after suffering damage at the start. Montoya retired from the lead with a driveshaft failure, and through it all came Raikkonen to take the win by a generous 36 seconds. Another dominant victory followed in Turkey, but he was left to rue some dim-witted driving from Juan Pablo when the Colombian carelessly clattered into the lapped Thiago Montero, and then ran wide at turn 8 later on, allowing Alonso to catch up and breeze past. 2 points gained on Fernando, but it should have been more. At this point, no one really blinked an eye when Kimi received another engine penalty in Italy, yet there was some very rapid eyelid movement when it looked like he might still become a victory. Just like in Britain and France, the team had loaded Raikkonen up with fuel, allowing him to gain ground early on in the race and jump up the order after the first round of stops. Despite a heavier car than a man doing some last-minute Christmas shopping, Kimi somehow took provisional pole, which became an 11th place start with his penalty. A steady few laps in 11th allowed him to conserve fuel, and thereafter the McLaren soared up the order as others pitted. When he made his one and only stop, he emerged 5th, and with all in front due to come in, if he could squeak past Alonso, the win was there for the taking. But then his left rear began to come apart, and so Kimi was left with no option but to return to the pits. From 12th he wrangled his way up to 4th, and it could have been better if he hadn't had a late race spin at the second chicane. That spin, the locked brake in Europe and the stalled start in Australia would be his only errors all year. It was back to the winner's circle in Belgium, but once more he was left to lament another lost McLaren 1-2 when the lapped Pitzonia clashed with Montoya, allowing Alonso through once more to keep the deficit at just 2 points lost. That left it at match point for Alonso heading to Brazil with a 25-point gap and 30 left to play for. A 3rd place was all he needed, and knowing his Renault was no match for the McLarens that day, that's what he comfortably did. Alonso became the youngest world champion, a record Kimi could have happily claimed for himself just 2 years before. With nothing left to play for, Raikkonen took 2nd in China, but most, if not all, will remember his iconic win in Japan, scything through from 17th on the grid to pass Giancarlo Fisichella for the win on the final lap of the race, in what is widely considered as one of the best F1 races of all time. Certainly it had a teenage mobile chicane punch in the air. Unlike 2003, there's little for us to debate when assigning blame to who lost the 2005 title between Raikkonen and McLaren. 7 of the 19 races that year saw McLaren make some form of mechanical or other blunder, and unlike say 2004 when those failures would deny Kimi a 6th place or an equally unimpressive result, 6 of those 7 fiascos denied Kimi a win. Yes, Kimi made errors once more, but aside from stalling in Australia, The locked brakes in Europe and the spin in Italy were brought about thanks to earlier faults from McLaren forcing the Finn to push as hard as he dared, to over the limit. A more reliable McLaren wouldn't have warranted the need to push like that. It should have been an absolute curb stomper of a year, one with 12 wins, 6 further podiums and a solitary 4th place as the worst result of the year, and 173 points to his name. It would have trounced the record of 148 points set by Schumacher the previous year, and would have set a record for most podiums in a season that wouldn't be equalled until Max Verstappen in 2021. Alonso would have taken a measly 3 wins, and the title would have been wrapped up with 4 rounds to go. A simultaneous snooze fest and richly deserved first title. Instead, Kimi found himself in the good company of the likes of Sterling Moss, Jackie Ickx and Ronnie Peterson as multi-time vice-champions, and wondering if he'd ever sit in a car simultaneously fast and reliable. He didn't have to wonder too long next year. The Finn failed to complete even 1 lap in qualifying for the season opener in Bahrain, thanks to a rear-end failure. It left him plumb last on the grid, but graced him with the opportunity to bask in the brilliance of the legendary UJE day on the same row of the grid. From there, Raikkonen tore through the fields, taking an eventual 3rd, the most positions gained at a Grand Prix in 13 years. But it could have, and perhaps should have, been more. A heavy fuel load and a great car setup left the rare sight of a happy Raikkonen in Malaysia, even starting 7th. But all smiles vanished when hopes of a good result were lost thanks to being taken out by Christian Klein on lap 1. Another victory opportunity went out the window in Australia when Kimi forced himself past Jenson Button in an attempt to pursue race leader Alonso, but locked his front right in doing so, leaving, not for the first time, a very shaky McLaren that would lead to front wing damage. Said damage left Kimi unable to match Alonso out front, and a later nose change put paid to any chance of snatching the win that day. Opportunities for a trio of good results had been and gone already, and a collection of 4th and 5th places over the next few rounds would have scant reward to Kimi, and nor was the unwelcome return of old friend Mr. Engine failure in Monaco. Running 2nd, Raikkonen was fueled for longer on his 2nd stint than Alonso, teeing up a tantalising thigh rubber of a sprint to the finish between the two. But a bodywork fire left the Finn buried in a plume of smoke at the side of the road, one from which Kimi infamously and furiously strode away from, and straight to a friend's yacht in the harbour. And rightly so. Not only was it the 10 billionth engine failure of his time at McLaren, but the same issue had already occurred during free practice, and the team had failed to fully solve the issue. As the battle for championship supremacy began to rage between Alonso and Schumacher, with Raikkonen nowhere near the mix, it would be easy to miss that with a few slight tweaks, Raikkonen could have won 4 of the opening 7 races at this point. 3rd in Britain should have been 2nd after a small airbox fire hoovered up the oxygen that the engine had just been about to chow down on, resulting in a stall at the pits, allowing Schumacher to zoom past. He stalled at the stops in Canada too, this time courtesy of a technical glitch, and perhaps that led to some feelings of disillusion in the car. With 2 laps to go, he ran wide at the hairpin and dropped to 3rd place. His outing in the USA lasted a few more metres than the previous year, all the way up to the first corner, where he was taken out by Montoya, who subsequently found himself out of the team and out of the sport within a few days. In came Pedro de la Rosa for the remainder of the year. 5th in France, where Kimi claimed that a delay at the stops cost him 4th, was followed by a troubled outing in Germany. First, a mess-up in qualifying left him under-fueled and needing a very early stop. There, a nut cross-threaded, and if any hopes to battle the Ferraris hadn't evaporated then, they did when hydraulic issues led to him driving some of the race with his key systems switched off. Soon after came 2 crashes and 2 races. In Hungary, amidst a plethora of penalties for Messrs Schumacher and Alonso, Kimi took pole and led for the opening 17 laps till he pitted. Emerging in 2nd place, his pace began to fade on his new set of tyres, whilst a wing adjustment in the pits wasn't helping matters either. Soon the hard-charging De La Rosa was on the prowl, and the orders came in for the two to swap positions, which Kimi went to do only to misjudge his approach on the lapped Tonio Liuzzi and collide with the Toro Rosso. Kimi claimed the Italian slowed on the racing line. Liuzzi responded saying he was trying to move over. There was less contention in his part of the opening corner melee in Turkey, where he tried to avoid Fisichella, only to receive a left rear puncture courtesy of the other Toro Rosso. The resulting damage led to crashing out a short while later. Second place in Italy was followed by an arguably more important press conference, when the great Michael Schumacher confirmed the rumours that everyone's respective mothers, grandmothers, neighbours, pets and second cousins twice removed suspected. 2006 would be Schumacher's last year in F1 before retiring, and Ferrari were happy to announce the signing of one Kimi Raikkonen as his replacement on a 3-year contract, as so many had predicted all those years ago. Sadly, there wasn't one final win to cap off those troubled McLaren years. In the hunt for a win in China, throttle troubles put pay to his hopes there. In Japan, scene of one of his most iconic triumphs 12 months previously, any hopes of replicating that same performance went out the window before the race even began, when McLaren incorrectly chose the softer Michelin compounds, hindering both cars in qualifying and the race, where Kimi salvaged 5th from 11th on the grid. And to round it out, a gripless struggle for 5th in Brazil, beaten home by the man he was set to replace, Schumacher, who Kimi had also missed receiving an honorary trophy before the race owing to going number 2. A winless year saw Raikkonen rank 5th overall, well adrift of the title fight with half the season's points tally of champion Alonso. But once more, if we tweak some results here and there, provide Kimi with reliable machinery, allow him to squeeze away unharmed from collisions out of his control, we instead get a fascinating 3-way title clash between himself, Alonso and Schumacher, with McLaren against Renault against Ferrari. A battle for the ages that results in Alonso just beating Kimi to the title, but does see the Kimster take second place. To the relief of all, 2007 saw Kimi finally place his icy mitts on the world title after, fittingly, main title rivals McLaren completely imploded and Raikkonen overcame a 17-point deficit with 2 rounds to go to pinch the title by a single point. As of 2023, he remains the last Ferrari driver to win the world title. There couldn't have been a more ironic foe for Kimi that year than those of the McLarens. Not only were they fast, but near bulletproof. After so many years of seeing the sight of Kimi Raikkonen clambering out of more smoky cars than non-smoked ones, it wouldn't be for another 32 races until a McLaren retired with a mechanical failure, Heikki Kovalainen at the 2008 Belgian Grand Prix, and even then he was still classified in 10th place. At the start of 2008, it seemed like we'd neatly segued from the Ferrari-Schumacher domination era to a whole new era of much the same with a Finn at the helm. After 5 races, he led the standings once more with 2 wins in that time. Yet no more came that year as teammate Massa took the title fight all the way to the final few moments of the year, whilst Kimi simply looked increasingly disinterested with the sport, all the way up until his eventual departure from Ferrari at the end of 2009. He spent some time racing in both the WRC and NASCAR across the next 2 years, and that seemed to reignite his passion for F1, opening the door for a return with Lotus in 2012. 2 wins in 2 years show that the Iceman still knew what he was doing, prompting a return to Ferrari for a 5-year stint there where he proved comfortably second best to the likes of Alonso and Vettel, but still hoovered up a host of podium appearances and a famous win at the 2018 US Grand Prix, 113 races after his last win, and as it turned out, his last. 3 years back at Sauber, now Alfa Romeo, left the Finn now fighting for points, but able to enjoy his racing as he occasionally dazzled, with his opening lap manoeuvre from 17th to 6th at the 2020 Portuguese Grand Prix, reminding everyone the old dog still knew a few tricks. He retired at the end of 2021, calling time on the career of one of F1's most successful and most memorable drivers. Undeniably, Kimi Raikkonen could have and should have left McLaren with 2 world titles in 2003 and 2005. 2003 was very much a could-have situation. We can debate until the cows come home whether Raikkonen would have truly deserved the title over Schumacher that year, but there can be little question that with more reliability, less mistakes, or an up-to-date car, Raikkonen could have been world champion that year. Conversely, 2005 was an undeniably a should-have, a year in which there can be little debate it was McLaren who were largely to blame for failing to deliver Kimi to an even then overdue first world title. Quite why the story worked out the way it did is a tricky one to untangle. Yes, the very familiar image of a smoking McLaren Mercedes parked at the side of the track is a bit of a giveaway here, but what was it that made such an iconic partnership, one with a proven track record of wins and world championships, one of the most frail on the grid? One argument would be that's just how it was at the time. Modern day cars are more or less bulletproof. 20 years ago, reliability woes were, much like fashioning an onion to your belt, the style at the time. It wasn't entirely uncommon for half the field to conk out at one stage. But such an argument falls down when we drag out the reliability receipts for Kimi's two biggest rivals within that same time period. Compared to Kimi's 39 McLaren-based maladies, not even factoring in other issues outside of either of their control, how often did Michael Schumacher's Ferrari let him down? Thrice. Bahrain 2005, Malaysia 2006, and Japan 2006. Even Fernando Alonso, perhaps a more reasonable yardstick for reliability averages compared to the Schumacher-Ferrari juggernaut, only suffered 8 mechanical retirements in that time frame. So the fault then lies with McLaren and with Mercedes. What did they get wrong that their rivals could only seem to get right? For my 2 cents, I feel like it comes down to a balance of risk, rewards, and an inevitable domino effect from that. Let's take 2005 as an example. A dreadful 2004, in itself already a knock-on from the logistical struggles of 2003, means perhaps already risks are being taken in car design and engine manufacture to ensure such a year can be avoided again. What you receive is the MP420, a car that shows a fair turn of speed in pre-season testing, but with the inevitable reliability gremlins of a team pushing the envelope. 2 failures in the first 4 races leave you on the back foot. If that doesn't incentivize you to take risks to get in front, then a pair of dominant wins shortly after shows you might have the fastest car on the grid. You may well do. Then your driver gets a flat spot, and because you're already so behind, you can't afford to settle for a safe second and pray you can make it to the end of the race. Which you don't. You scream to the engine department for more power to close that gap, and what you get instead is too much power and failure after failure. At that point, damage is already done, and the championship's gone. All it can take is one failure, whether self-inflicted or not, to drop you from being the hunted to the hunter. And what does an outfit do when left on the back foot? You're left needing to take risks, especially in an era where your main opposition is proving totally unflappable. But when that gamble doesn't pay off, you're even more behind, so more risks come into play. Reliability woes as you push materials and resources to breaking point. Car troubles as you desperately try to push the limits of the regulations to the absolute limit, and inevitably topple over that. By McLaren failing to get one initial thing right, it led to a whole lot of stuff going wrong. And debatably, was the temperament of Kimi, leave me alone, I know what I'm doing, Raikkonen, a good fit for such an environment? It's easy to reflect on this time with rose-tinted glasses and shake our fists angrily in a Wokingwood direction. But given how we know from historical data how disinterested and unmotivated Kimi could become in uncompetitive machinery, is it unreasonable or unfair to suggest that bad luck led to bad choices, led to a lack of motivation, and thus some inevitable errors and mistakes from someone increasingly sick of the same situation year after year? In the end, Raikkonen departed from McLaren a 2-time vice-champion with 9 wins. But in a more perfect world, that reads instead Kimi Raikkonen 2-time world champion with 22 wins. Add those stats to his future success with Ferrari and Lotus, and Raikkonen could have departed F1 as part of an elite group of 3-time world champions, and one with 34 race wins, ranking him as the 7th most successful driver of all time. Another fanciful what-if is that maybe, just maybe, a more reliable car could have kept Raikkonen there for a few more years, rather than jumping across to Ferrari. We could have had a mouth-watering prospect of Raikkonen and Alonso at their peaks together. Or assuming that Alonso was signed with the expectation of Raikkonen leaving, then a Raikkonen and Hamilton combination. With a McLaren at the top of the field in 2007 and 2008, theoretically you could have a Raikkonen with 4 world titles to his name by then, making him McLaren's most successful driver of all time, surpassing the trio of titles from the legendary pairing of Prost and Senna. Of course, the what-ifs and lamentations of this tale are perhaps the most ironic of all the stories we've covered, given the personality of our protagonist here. One of the sport's fastest ever, but also one more than content to nip off for a chalk ice while waiting for a race to restart. A man who was asleep 30 minutes before his first ever F1 race. A man who, if you asked the opinion on his legacy, would say that whatever you remember, good way or bad way, it's a memory and it's fine. For all the prospective world titles and reliable machinery, we wouldn't have him any other way. So whilst I and so many others might weep and wail over what could have been, I'd happily bet a large amount of money that if you were to ask Kimi Raikkonen what he's doing while this video plays, he'd probably tell you he was having a... well, you get the picture. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider pulling into the pitbox of my channel, bolting on the tyres of hitting that subscribe button, and tearing off the fresh visor of hitting the like button. I've had word from the pitwall that it's the best strategy available for you.